Hello everyone. Before we begin, I'd love to know where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. Let me know in the comments. If you enjoy our stories, please like the video and subscribe for more. And now, turn off the lights, close your eyes, and relax. I'd been living in the building for 4 months when I realized I'd never seen the neighbor from 4B. I knew almost all the other neighbors by sight, even if I didn't know most of their names. The young couple on the first floor who went running every morning at 7 and came back half an hour later with red faces and sneakers wet with dew, walking into the entryway, laughing and pushing each other with that energy couples have when they haven't been together long enough to stop having fun. The old man on the 3rd floor who came down to the entryway for his newspaper every morning at 8 on the dot and sat reading it on the wooden bench by the mailboxes for exactly an hour before dragging his feet up the stairs because he didn't trust the elevator since he got stuck in it for 40 minutes one summer years ago. The woman on the 5th floor who had 2 gray cats and sometimes left her apartment door slightly open to let a draft through from the hallway. And the cats would poke their heads out with that calculated indifference cats have when they're looking at something that doesn't interest them, but they can. Stop watching because their instinct tells them that everything that moves deserves attention. The couple on the 2nd floor who argued on Sunday mornings with such predictable regularity that I'd already incorporated it into my weekend routine as just another background noise of the building. I knew them all by their routines, by their schedules, by the sounds they made opening and closing their doors, which after 4 months were part of the building, as a soundtrack like the hum of the elevator, or the creak of the pipes when someone turned on the hot water in any apartment, and the whole building seemed to groan through its plumbing like an old organism with aching joints. But the neighbor in 4B had no routine. She had no schedule. She had no sound. Her door never opened and never closed. At least not during the hours when the rest of us were awake and could hear it. Her name wasn't on the mailbox, which was the only one in the row with no identifying label. Just the oxidized brass slot with no name beneath it, where flyers and supermarket catalogs accumulated. No one ever picking them up, until over time they formed a small mound of crumpled yellowing paper that the janitor swept away each week without comment, as if it were part of his regular duties, just like sweeping the leaves that blew into the entryway, or cleaning the mud stains neighbors left on the floor on rainy days. She lived on the 4th floor, the same as me. My apartment was 4A, to the left of the landing when you got out of the elevator. Hers was 4B to the right. Our doors were separated by 3 meters of landing with old tile flooring, and a small window that faced the building's interior courtyard, letting in a gray, weak light that couldn't fully illuminate the space between the 2 doors, creating a permanent twilight zone where daylight didn't reach strongly enough, and where the ceiling light bulb, one of those energy-saving bulbs that takes a minute to reach full brightness, left the corners in semi-darkness, making the shadows of the doors and the window frames stretch along the walls like fingers reaching for something they couldn't touch. Every time I left my apartment or came back in, I passed by her door. It was a door just like mine, varnished wood with a brass peephole and a dark brown doormat that looked new because no one ever stepped on it. Not a single shoe mark, not a single mud stain. None of the signs of use a doormat accumulates when someone steps on it daily. I'd never seen light coming from under her door. Day or night, you never heard music or television or conversation or footsteps or the sound of water running through pipes or the clink of silverware or the thud of a cabinet closing or any of the sounds an inhabited apartment inevitably produces simply because someone lives inside and does the things people do when they're home. Cooking, showering, walking from one room to another, accidentally dropping something on the floor. All those tiny sounds that form the background noise of domestic life and seep through the walls and floors of old buildings where soundproofing was an idea nobody considered when they were built. From 4B, none of those sounds came. It was as if the apartment were empty, as if behind that varnished wooden door there were nothing but empty, silent rooms where dust accumulated on furniture nobody cleaned and light didn't come through the windows because the blinds had been down for years. But it wasn't empty. I knew because the packages arrived. Every day, sometimes twice a day and on occasion 3 times, the delivery person would bring packages up to the 4th floor and leave them in front of the door to 4B. Brown cardboard boxes of different sizes, with no visible return address on any of them, sealed with thick packing tape and a shipping label that only had the building number, the floor, and the letter B, with no recipient name. The most frequent boxes were medium-sized, about the size of a large shoebox or a bit bigger. But every now and then, long, narrow boxes arrived that could have contained anything, and the delivery people would lean them against the wall by the door with a care that seemed excessive for a simple package. The boxes would pile up in front of the door during the day, forming a small barricade of brown cardboard that sometimes reached 4 or 5 stacked boxes, and at some point between night and early morning, they would disappear. I never heard the door open to pick them up. I never heard the sound of cardboard dragging across the tile floor of the landing, or the click of a lock, or the groan of hinges, or the soft thud of a door closing after something was brought inside. The boxes were simply there when I went to sleep and gone when I woke up in the morning, as if someone collected them in the deepest silence of the night, in those hours between 3 and 5 in the morning when sleep is so heavy that the sounds of the building disappear and the world shrinks to the inside of your own room with your eyes closed. I asked the janitor, a man named Gonzalo who'd been in the building for over 20 years and knew the schedules and habits of every neighbor with the precision of a Swiss watch. Gonzalo was a short, stocky man with close-cropped graying hair and large hands that were always busy with something. A broom, a screwdriver, a rag, the keys to the meter room. He had the weathered face of someone who'd spent many hours in a building's entryway watching people come and go, and had developed the ability to read people by the way they walked, by the time they arrived, by the sound their keys made when they pulled them from their pocket. I asked him who lived in 4B. Gonzalo was sweeping the entryway when I asked, and he stopped sweeping for a second. Just 1 second that was enough to break the rhythm of the broom and give him away, before resuming the movement with the same cadence as always. He told me a woman lived in 4B. He didn't tell me her name. He told me she'd been living there since before he started working in the building, and that in 20 years he'd seen her in person fewer than 5 times, always briefly, always on the 4th floor landing, always at hours when no one else was on the stairs. He told me she was a woman who wanted no contact with the neighbors or anyone, and had expressly asked not to be disturbed, that her door should never be knocked on for any reason, and that packages should be left on the landing without ringing the bell and without waiting for a response. I asked him about the packages, why she received so many and what they might contain. Gonzalo looked at me with an expression that wasn't hostile but wasn't open either, an expression of a door locked with a bolt and chain, and told me it was none of his business what neighbors received in their homes and that it shouldn't be any of mine either. He told me the best thing I could do was the same thing all the other neighbors in the building did, which was to pay no attention to 4B and go on with my life, as if that apartment didn't exist on the other side of the landing. I asked him if anyone else had asked questions about the neighbor before me. Gonzalo pressed his lips together and looked toward the back of the entryway, as if weighing how much he could tell me without crossing a line someone had drawn long ago. He told me yes, other neighbors had asked over the years, especially those who lived in 4A, because they were the ones who shared the landing with her and saw the packages piling up every day in front of a door that never opened. He told me they'd all stopped asking after a while, that eventually everyone understood there are things in a building it's better not to investigate, and the neighbor in 4B was one of those things. He said it with the naturalness of someone giving practical advice, like telling you not to touch an electrical outlet because it shocks you, and you don't need to understand electricity to know the shock hurts. But beneath that naturalness was something deeper, something that resembled learned fear. Fear that no longer feels like fear but like habit. Because you've lived with it for so many years, it's become part of your routine, just like locking your door or looking both ways before crossing the street. I didn't listen. Curiosity was stronger than caution, and stronger than the increasingly clear feeling that the neighbors knew something about 4B that they, decided not to tell me and probably never would tell me because telling it would mean acknowledging they knew it, and acknowledging they knew it would mean acknowledging they'd accepted living with it. I started paying closer attention to the packages. I noticed the labels, which always had the same small cramped handwriting in black ink that traced the letters with an almost mechanical precision. I noticed the boxes, which never had a logo from any known shipping company and were sealed with an excessive amount of packing tape, as if whoever prepared them wanted to make sure they wouldn't accidentally open during transport. I noticed the weight. One morning before leaving for work, I lifted one of the medium boxes that were in front of the door to 4B just to get an idea of what it contained. It weighed much more than its size suggested. It was like lifting a shoebox filled with rocks or metal, or something compact and dense that concentrated a lot of mass in a small volume. I set it back down carefully and went to work with the feeling of having touched something I shouldn't have touched. One Tuesday night around 11, I heard something coming from the landing. It wasn't the sound of the elevator or the footsteps of a neighbor coming up the stairs. It was a sound I hadn't heard in the 4 months I'd been living there. A soft, steady dragging, like something heavy sliding across the tile floor with a slow, careful friction, calculated to make as little noise as possible, but which in the silence of 11 o'clock at night sounded with a clarity that made me look up from the book I was reading on the couch and turn my head toward my apartment door. The sound lasted about 10 seconds, then it stopped. Then I heard something that might have been a door opening but didn't produce the click of a lock or the creak of hinges, just a softer, more organic sound, like the rub of wood against wood when humidity has swollen the frame and the door fits with difficulty into its place. Then silence again, that dense silence of the building at night that makes you doubt whether what you just heard was real or your brain filling the void with sounds that don't exist. I got up and went to my door. I looked through the peephole. The landing was empty. The boxes that had been in front of the door to 4B were gone. The door to 4B was closed as always, but there was something on the landing floor that hadn't been there before. A stain, small, dark, irregular, on the tile right in front of the door to 4B. It could have been water. It could have been some liquid spilled from one of the boxes when it was dragged across the floor. It could have been many things, but in the gray light of the landing, that light the energy-saving bulb cast with its sickly glow, the stain had a color that didn't look like water, or any household liquid I could imagine. It was a dark reddish brown, dense, glistening under the light as if still wet, as if it had been spilled just seconds ago. The next morning the stain was gone. The landing floor was clean, washed with a product that left a smell of bleach that wasn't the usual smell of the landing, and took hours to dissipate. Someone had cleaned the stain during the night with the same meticulous care with which they collected the packages, leaving no trace, making no noise, with no one able to confirm that what I'd seen through the peephole was real. On Thursday of that week, something happened that changed the situation. The delivery person brought a package at noon and knocked on my door because no one answered at 4B. He was a young man in a uniform from a shipping company I didn't recognize, with no visible logo. Just a dark gray work jumpsuit with a number embroidered on the chest. He asked if he could leave the package with me for me to give to the neighbor when I saw her. I accepted without thinking. The package was a medium box that weighed more than its size suggested, much more, as if the contents were something compact and dense that pulled my arms downward with a force that didn't correspond to a box that size. I left it in my entryway and stood looking at it for a while, thinking I should take it to the landing and leave it in front of the door to 4B like the delivery people did every day. But I didn't take it to the landing. I left it in my entryway all afternoon and all night, with an excuse I gave myself that consisted of telling myself I was waiting to hear the neighbor so I could hand it to her in person and have an excuse to see her and talk to her. The real reason was something else. I wanted to see what would happen if the packages didn't reach her door. I wanted to see if the neighbor would come out looking for them. I wanted to provoke a reaction that would break the pattern of silence and invisibility I'd been observing for months without understanding, like someone throwing a stone into a pond that's been still too long just to see what's beneath the surface. The reaction came at 3 in the morning. I woke up to a sound coming from my apartment door. It wasn't a knock or a doorbell or knuckles against wood. It was a rub, something sliding across the outer surface of my door with a slow, continuous motion, up and down, like a hand caressing a surface searching for something it can't find with its eyes, something that can only be located by touch. The rubbing lasted about 30 seconds that stretched in the darkness of my bedroom as if time had thickened. Then it stopped. Then I heard something that made me sit up in bed with my heart pounding against my ribs and my breath held behind clenched teeth. A voice, a woman's voice coming from the other side of my door, from the landing, saying a single word in a tone that wasn't a whisper and wasn't a normal voice but something in between, something calibrated with surgical precision to penetrate the wood of the door and reach my ears and only mine. The word was my name. She said my name, and then said I had something of hers, that I needed to give it back to her, that what was inside the box couldn't be outside the house any longer. I got up. I went to the door barefoot and silent, stepping on the cold tiles of my hallway with the feeling of walking towards something I shouldn't see, but needed to see to stop imagining it. I looked through the peephole. What I saw made me step back with a movement that wasn't voluntary but a reflex of my body reacting before my mind could process what I was seeing through the fisheye lens that distorted the image and made it even more unsettling than it already was. There was a face on the other side of the peephole. A woman's face pressed against the door, so close to the glass that it filled the entire field of vision like a pale, deformed moon. A thin, angular face with skin so pale it wasn't the pallor of someone who doesn't go out but something deeper, more organic. The pallor of something that hasn't seen sunlight for so long it's forgotten how to react to it. And the eyes. The eyes were open in a way that wasn't normal. Too wide. The eyelids drawn back to show the white around the iris. An iris that was a color I couldn't determine because the landing light was too weak, but that seemed light, almost transparent, as if the eyes were made of glass or something that imitated glass without quite being it. And the mouth was open, just enough to show the teeth and to form the words she was repeating with that calibrated voice that penetrated the wood, as if the door didn't exist. She repeated my name. She repeated that I had something of hers. And then she said something else that froze my blood with a cold that started at the back of my neck and ran down my spine to the soles of my bare feet on the tiles. She said that what was inside the box needed to return to her before it woke up, that it had been sleeping for a long time, and that if it woke up outside the house it would look for where it was, and she didn't want it to look, that no one in the building wanted it to look, that the walls weren't enough to stop it when it was awake, and that only she knew how to keep it asleep, and that for that she needed what was inside the boxes, all the boxes, every day without exception, without delay, without anyone holding on to them or opening them or touching them more than necessary. I grabbed the box from the entryway. I lifted it with both hands and felt again that weight that didn't correspond to its size, that weight that pulled my arms downward, as if the gravity inside the box was different from the rest of the world. I opened my apartment door just enough to stick my arms out with the box, and set it on the landing floor without looking forward, without raising my eyes, without seeking the face I'd seen through the peephole. I didn't want to see it without the distorted filter of the glass. I didn't want to see it face to face, life-size, with those eyes that looked like glass and that mouth that talked about something that slept and shouldn't wake. I set the box on the floor and slammed the door shut. I locked it. I bolted it. I stood with my back against the door, my hands trembling. I heard the sound of the box dragging across the tile floor of the landing to the right, toward the door to 4B. I heard the damp, soft sound of that door opening without a lock and without hinges, as if it opened by a mechanism that had nothing to do with the mechanics of normal doors. I heard the silence that followed when the door closed with that sound of swollen wood against swollen wood, and then, for a few seconds that stretched in the darkness like something elastic that doesn't want to break, I heard something coming from inside 4B through the wall that separated our apartments. A sound that wasn't human or animal or mechanical. A sound like something large moving inside a space too small to contain it. A creaking of walls, a groan of strained pipes, a tremor in the floor that I felt through the tiles under my bare feet, and that rose up my legs to my stomach with a low, deep vibration that lasted 3 or 4 seconds before stopping as abruptly as it had started. And after the tremor, silence. Complete silence, as if whatever had moved inside 4B had gone back to sleep. I haven't touched the packages that arrived for 4B since. The delivery people leave them on the landing, and I walk past them every day without looking at them, without touching them, without wondering what they contain or why she needs them, or what it is that lives inside that apartment with a woman who never leaves and needs those boxes every day to keep something asleep that shouldn't be awake. Gonzalo looks at me differently since that night. I don't know how he knows what happened, but he knows. The same way he knows what time each neighbor leaves and what time they return and which noises are normal and which aren't. He looks at me with the same closed-door expression he had when I asked him about the neighbor. But now there's something else. Something resembling the compassion of someone who sees that another person has finally understood something. He understood 20 years ago, and that can't be explained, only experienced. And every night when I go to bed and the building falls silent, I hear the sounds from 4B through the wall that separates our apartments. They aren't the sounds of a woman living alone. They are the sounds of something moving inside an enclosed space with a weight that makes the floor creak and the pipes vibrate, and the partition wall between her living room and mine tremble with a low frequency I feel more in my stomach than in my ears. And sometimes, just before I fall asleep, I hear a soft, rhythmic tapping coming from the wall, as if something on the other side was knocking, not at the hallway door, at my wall, as if it knew I was here, as if what sleeps inside the boxes isn't entirely asleep anymore and is looking for a way out. I moved into the building in September, to a second-floor interior apartment that faced a narrow air shaft where the sun barely squeezed through for a couple of hours at noon. It was an old 5-story building with a brick facade darkened by years of weather. The entryway with terrazzo floors and walls painted a faded green that must have once been bright. A small elevator that smelled like old metal and pine air freshener and made a sound of straining cables every time it moved. And a marble staircase worn down by decades of footsteps that had carved hollows into the center of each step like miniature riverbeds. It was a quiet building, the kind where neighbors recognize each other by sight and nod hello in the lobby, but nobody really knows what the person next door does, or what their name is, or what they're about. The type of building where you could live for years without having more of a conversation with your neighbors than a good morning in the elevator and a good night on the stairs. The apartment came with a storage unit in the basement, one of the perks that had convinced me to sign the lease. The storage unit was number 7, at the end of the right-hand hallway. A 2-by-3-meter cubicle with exposed brick walls and a wooden door with a padlock that screeched like it hadn't been opened in years when I first put the key in. The basement was a large space divided into 2 hallways that formed an L shape. The main hallway ran from the stairs to the back of the building, with numbered storage unit doors on both sides. The second hallway turned left at the end of the first, and led to the electrical meters in the boiler room, which hummed with a deep, constant noise that seeped through the basement walls like the heartbeat of a mechanical engine buried beneath the building. The lighting was from old fluorescent fixtures that took a few seconds to fully turn on, and during those seconds they flickered with an intermittent light that made the hallway seem like a different place every time the light went out and came back on, as if with each flicker, the space slightly shifted shape and returned to normal before you could notice what had changed. The first time I went down to the basement to drop off boxes was a Saturday morning. I carried 4 boxes of books and tools from the apartment to the storage unit, making several trips down the stairs because the boxes wouldn't fit in the elevator. On the 3rd or 4th trip, while I was walking down the basement hallway toward my unit with a box of tools that was killing my arms, I noticed something I hadn't seen on the previous trips. Between storage unit number 5 and storage unit number 7, which was mine, there was a door. It wasn't the door to unit number 6. The storage unit doors were all the same, light-colored wood with a number painted at the top and a metal padlock on the latch. This door was different. It was larger than the others, made of darker, older wood, with no number, no visible padlock, no markings of any kind. It was set into the wall like it was part of the building's original structure, like it had been there since the building was constructed, and the other doors had been installed later around it. The frame was stone instead of wood, with irregular edges that looked hand-carved, and the door's surface had a rough, uneven texture that wasn't peeling paint, but the wood itself aged by decades of humidity and darkness. I stopped in front of it with the box in my arms and stared at it for a few seconds, trying to place it in the mental layout I'd made of the basement. It didn't fit. The storage units were numbered 1 through 10, and each corresponded to an apartment in the building. 5 floors, 2 units per floor, 10 total. There was no missing unit number 6, no gap between 5 and 7 that would require an additional door. That door didn't correspond to anything. I dropped the box in my unit, and when I came out, I passed by it again. The door was closed. There was no visible knob or handle, just a smooth surface of dark wood with a gap at the bottom about 2 centimeters wide, through which no light or air came, nothing to indicate what was on the other side. I stepped closer and tried to push it with my hand. It didn't move. It was so fixed in its frame it seemed more like a wall than a door, as if it were sealed from the inside, or as if whatever was behind it was pressing against it to keep it closed. I asked Ricardo, the neighbor on the first floor who'd been living in the building for over 30 years and was the living memory of the community, a retired man who spent his mornings sitting on a bench in the entryway, reading the newspaper, and knew the history of every apartment, every neighbor, and every breakdown the building had suffered since he moved in back in the 80s. I asked him about the unnumbered door in the basement. Ricardo stopped reading his paper and looked at me over his glasses with an expression that wasn't exactly surprise, but something like resignation, as if he'd been waiting for someone to ask him that question, and at the same time hoping no one ever would. He told me the door had always been there, that when he moved in, it was already there, and the neighbors who lived in the building before him had told him the same thing, that the door was already there when they arrived. He told me nobody knew what was behind it, that it didn't correspond to any storage unit or utility room or any space that appeared on the building's blueprints, that the homeowners association had tried to find out years ago when they did some renovations in the basement to fix moisture problems, but the mason who checked the area said there was a brick wall behind the door and that the door led nowhere, that it was probably a door from an earlier construction that had gotten embedded in the foundations when the new structure was built on top. He told me not to worry about it, that it was just an old door that led nowhere and had been closed since before anyone living in the building could remember. He said it with the naturalness of someone explaining an unimportant architectural quirk, but I noticed that while he talked, he wasn't looking me in the eyes but staring at the entryway floor with an intensity that didn't match a casual conversation, and when he finished speaking, he added something he said as if it were a minor comment, but that sounded like something he'd been wanting to say for a while. He told me that over the years some neighbors had mentioned that sometimes, when they went down to the basement at night to get something from their units, they had the impression that the door was slightly open. Just an impression, he said, an effect of the bad lighting from the fluorescence that made the shadows at the edge of the door look like an open crack, when actually the door was closed as always. He told me not to worry about it, that it was the kind of thing that happens in old basements, where the light is bad and imagination works overtime. During the first few weeks, I didn't go down to the basement much, only when I needed something from the boxes I'd stored in my unit, or when I had to put away something that wouldn't fit in the apartment. Every time I passed by the unnumbered door, I'd glance at it quickly without stopping. It was closed. Always closed. The same rough surface of dark wood, the same stone frame, the same bottom gap through which nothing could be seen. I started to stop noticing it. The way you stop noticing a painting you've seen every day for weeks that becomes part of the scenery, until one day something changes, and you see it again, as if for the first time. That day came on a Thursday in October, a month and a half after I'd moved in. I went down to the basement at 10 at night to get a screwdriver I'd left in one of the toolboxes. The fluorescents took longer than usual to turn on, as if the electricity was reaching them reluctantly, and during the seconds they flickered before stabilizing. The basement hallway filled with intermittent shadows that moved with the light like something alive stirring in the corners. Each time darkness returned for a fraction of a second. I walked down the hallway to my unit with my eyes half closed from the flickering, and when I passed the unnumbered door, I stopped. Not by my own choice, but because something at the edge of my vision caught my attention before my brain could process what it was. The door was slightly open. Not much. A centimeter, maybe less. Just enough that the straight uniform line of the door's edge against the frame was broken by a shadow that shouldn't have been there. A vertical crack running from about waist height to the floor, darker than the darkness of the hallway. Denser, as if what was behind that door wasn't a brick wall like the mason had said, but a space, a void, a place with depth that absorbed light instead of reflecting it. I moved closer. I put my hand on the door's surface to push it and see if it would open more. The wood was cold and damp with a dampness that wasn't the normal basement humidity, but something more organic, like the surface of something that was sweating. I pushed gently. The door moved another centimeter with a low sound that wasn't a hinge creak, but something like a sigh, as if the air inside was escaping through the gap as the opening widened. And with the air came a smell. It wasn't the smell of mustiness or humidity or accumulated dust. It was a smell I couldn't identify, but it triggered an instinctive reaction that made me pull my hand away from the door and step back before my brain could analyze what I was smelling. It was something my body recognized as dangerous before my mind could put a name to it. I went to my storage unit, grabbed the screwdriver, and went back up to the apartment without looking at the door again. That night I didn't sleep well. I woke up at 3 in the morning with the feeling that I'd forgotten something in the basement. Something important I should have done or not done that I couldn't remember. The feeling stayed with me for days like background noise I couldn't turn off. I went down to the basement 3 days later, on a Sunday afternoon. The fluorescents turned on normally this time, and the hallway lit up with its usual whitish light. I walked to the unnumbered door. It was closed. Exactly as I'd seen it the first time, without any crack, without any opening. The wood pressed against the frame as if it had never been open. I put my hand on the surface. It was dry and cold but not damp. I pushed. It didn't move. As solid as a wall. I crouched down and looked through the bottom gap, those 2 centimeters between the door and the floor. Darkness. Just darkness. But a darkness that had something strange about it. It wasn't the flat, uniform darkness of an enclosed, empty space. It was a darkness with depth, with layers, as if the space behind the door extended further than should have been possible in a basement, bounded by the building's foundations and the earth beneath. In the following weeks, I went down to the basement more often than necessary. I made up excuses to go down. Tools I needed to find, boxes to reorganize, things to put away that could have waited weeks without me missing them. Every time I went down, I checked the door. During the day, it was always closed. At night, when I went down after 10, sometimes it was slightly open. Not always. I couldn't predict when I'd find it open and when closed. But the trend was clear. Each time I found it open, the opening was a little larger than the last time. First it was a centimeter, then 2, then 3. I measured it with a ruler I brought down from the apartment, my hands trembling and my heart racing as I pressed it against the door's edge. 3 centimeters of darkness between the door and the frame, through which came that smell I still couldn't identify, but that was getting stronger, more present, harder to ignore. I mentioned to Ricardo about the door being slightly open. He looked at me with the same expression from that first conversation, that mix of resignation and something darker that might have been old fear. Fear cured by years until it became habit. He told me, like he'd already explained, it was an effect of the light, that the basement fluorescents were old and shadows played tricks. I told him I'd measured it with a ruler, that it wasn't shadows, that the door was opening. Ricardo was quiet for a moment, folding the newspaper on his knees with slow mechanical movements. Then he told me something he hadn't told me the first time. He told me that about 15 years ago, a neighbor from the 4th floor, a man named Felipe who was a curious and somewhat obsessive type, had become determined to find out what was behind that door. Felipe went down to the basement every night with a flashlight and a notebook where he recorded his observations. He measured the door's opening every night for weeks, and came to the same conclusion I had. The door was opening, little by little, almost imperceptibly, but with a consistency that couldn't be attributed to temperature changes or wood expansion or any normal physical process. Ricardo told me that one night Felipe went down to the basement intending to open the door all the way and go in. I know because Felipe told me that afternoon, Ricardo said. He told me he was going to end the mystery once and for all. That he'd been observing the door for weeks and was tired of not knowing what was behind it. That night, Felipe went down to the basement at 11. Ricardo heard him going down the stairs from his first-floor apartment because Felipe didn't take the elevator, and his footsteps echoed on the marble steps with a determined rhythm that held no fear. Ricardo stayed awake waiting to hear Felipe come back up. He didn't hear him. The next morning, he went down to the basement. The hallway was empty. The unnumbered door was closed. Felipe's flashlight was on the floor, in front of the door, still on, although the battery was almost dead, and the light was barely an orange dot flickering against the dark wood. The notebook was next to the flashlight, open to the last written page. Ricardo looked at the page. There was only one sentence written in handwriting that didn't look like Felipe's because it was shaky and uneven, as if he'd written it with the wrong hand, or in the dark, or while something was pulling him somewhere. The sentence said, "There are stairs that go down." Felipe never returned to his apartment. His family reported his disappearance, and the police searched the building from top to bottom, including the basement. They checked all the storage units, the boiler room, the electrical meters. They tried to open the unnumbered door, but it was closed, as solid as a wall. And when they hit it with a sledgehammer, the sound it returned was that of something solid, with no hollow space behind it, as if behind the door there was nothing but brick and earth. The police concluded that Felipe had left the building on his own during the night, and that his disappearance had nothing to do with the basement. The case was closed. Ricardo never showed them the notebook or the flashlight. He kept them in his storage unit and never spoke of the matter again until that conversation with me, 15 years later, sitting on the bench in the entryway with the newspaper folded on his knees, and an expression on his face that told me he'd spent 15 years going down to the basement to check his storage unit, trying not to look at the door and knowing the door was there, waiting, each night a little more open for whoever wanted to measure the gap with a ruler and go down to see what was behind it. That night, I went down to the basement for the last time. I don't know why I did it. I had nothing to look for and nothing to put away. I went down because I needed to see the door one more time, needed to confirm what I already knew. The fluorescents flickered as they turned on, and the hallway lit up in fits and starts with that intermittent light that turned every shadow into movement and every corner into a hiding place. I walked to the unnumbered door and stopped in front of it. It was open, not slightly open. Open. About 15 centimeters of opening through which I could see inside for the first time. But there was nothing to see. Just darkness. That deep, layered darkness I'd seen through the gap at the bottom but now at eye level, stretching behind the door like a vertical pit turned on its side. And the smell I'd been trying to identify for weeks and that now, with the door open 15 centimeters, was strong enough to recognize. It smelled like earth, like damp, deep earth, like earth that's underneath something and hasn't seen light for a very long time. And beneath the smell of earth, another smell, fainter, that made me step back with my heart pounding in my chest. It smelled like breathed air, like air that had passed through lungs and come out with that slightly sweet warmth that living breath has. As if what was behind the door wasn't an empty space but an inhabited one. As if something on the other side was breathing in the darkness, and its breath was coming through the opening in the door and brushing against my face with a warmth that shouldn't exist in a basement at a constant 15 degrees. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. I turned on the flashlight and aimed it at the opening. The light entered through the 15-centimeter gap and found no wall. It found no brick or earth or bottom. The light disappeared into the darkness as if it had been swallowed, absorbed by something beyond the reach of a cell phone flashlight. But for a second, just before the darkness swallowed the light, I saw something. An edge, a geometric shape protruding from the darkness about 2 meters from the door at floor level. It was the edge of a stone step descending downward toward a place that was below the basement, below the foundations, below everything the building knew about itself. There are stairs that go down. That's what Felipe had written in his trembling handwriting in his notebook before he disappeared. And he was right. There were stairs, and they went down. I turned off the flashlight. I stepped back 3 paces without taking my eyes off the door's opening. The darkness inside stared back at me with the density of something that has eyes, even if you can't see them. And then I heard something coming from behind the door, from somewhere on those stairs that led down to where nothing should be. A sound. Soft, rhythmic, distant. Footsteps. Someone coming up the stairs, coming up slowly, with the patience of someone who's been walking in the darkness for a long time and isn't in a hurry, because they know the door is open. And this time the opening is enough. Each step sounded a little closer than the last. Each step made the smell of earth and breath intensify by a degree, as if whatever was climbing brought with it the air from the place it came from. I ran up to the apartment. I ran up the stairs, not the elevator, because I couldn't wait the 30 seconds it would take for the elevator to come up from the basement, and I needed to move, needed my legs to do something other than tremble. I went into my apartment, locked the door behind me, and sat on the couch with all the lights on and my heart pounding against my ribs with a force that hurt. I haven't gone back down to the basement. It's been 2 weeks. My tools and boxes are still in storage unit number 7, And they're going to stay there because I'm not going back down that hallway or past that door that I no longer know if it's slightly open or fully open now. Ricardo hasn't said anything more about it. When we run into each other in the entryway, he greets me with his usual nod and goes back to his newspaper as if our conversation about Felipe and the door and the stairs had never happened. But I've noticed something I hadn't noticed before. Ricardo never goes down to the basement. In the 2 months I've lived here, I haven't seen him go down even once. His storage unit is number 2, the closest to the stairs, the farthest from the unnumbered door. But not even that distance seems enough for him. And every night when I go to bed in my second-floor apartment and turn off the lights and the building falls silent, I hear something coming from below. Not from Ricardo's first floor, from further down, from the basement. A soft, rhythmic, spaced-out sound, like footsteps, but not footsteps walking down a hallway. Footsteps climbing stairs, stairs that shouldn't exist, and yet exist beneath an unnumbered door in a basement, where one night 15 years ago, a man named Felipe wrote 3 words in a notebook before disappearing forever. And every night, the footsteps sound a little higher, one step closer to the door, one step closer to those of us living above whatever is down there. The noise started on a Monday in November at 2 in the morning. A sharp, repetitive thumping coming from somewhere in the building that woke me from a deep sleep, with the abruptness of a hand shaking your shoulder in the middle of the night. At first I thought it was the neighbor upstairs, who sometimes moved furniture at ungodly hours, with that lack of consideration people have when they live alone and have lost all sense that their noises filter through the floor and become the problem of whoever lives below. But the thumping wasn't coming from above. It was coming from farther away. From some point in the building I couldn't pinpoint from my bed because the sound was muffled by the walls and ceilings and floors separating the apartments, turning any noise into something diffuse, without clear direction, as if the building itself were a giant resonance chamber that picked up sounds from any point in its structure and distributed them everywhere with an evenness that made it impossible to determine their exact origin. The thumping lasted about 20 minutes. 20 minutes of a rhythm that was constant and irregular at the same time, like someone hammering against something hard but without a fixed pattern. Sometimes fast with bursts of 3 or 4 blows in a row, sometimes slow with pauses of several seconds between impacts, sometimes with a force that made the walls of my bedroom vibrate, and sometimes with softer blows that sounded like someone feeling for a specific spot on a surface, striking different places until they found it. Then it stopped abruptly, without gradually fading out the way noises do when whoever's making them gets tired or decides to save it for another time. It stopped, as if someone had flipped a switch. 1 second there was noise and the next there was silence. A silence that after 20 minutes of thumping seemed deeper than normal, denser, as if the building needed a moment to recover from the effort of channeling that sound through its structure of brick and concrete and steel beams that had been holding up 5 floors of apartments over a damp, dark basement for more than 80 years. I turned over in bed and went back to sleep thinking I'd mention the nighttime noises to the janitor the next day. I lived on the 4th floor of an old downtown building, one of those 6-story buildings with a stone facade blackened by decades of pollution and wrought iron balconies that had once been elegant and were now rusted along the edges. An orange rust that stained the stone beneath each balcony like dried tears the building shed without anyone bothering to clean them. The entryway had terrazzo flooring worn down by generations of neighbors who had walked on it until carving an invisible path between the street door and the elevator, and the walls were painted dark green up to the midpoint and a yellowish white from there to the ceiling, with a border of hand-painted tiles that must have been pretty in the 40s, but was now chipped in several places and covered by a patina of grime that no amount of cleaning could completely remove. The building was over 80 years old, and it showed in everything. In the walls that creaked when the temperature changed, with sharp snaps that sounded like wooden knuckles punching the plaster from inside. In the pipes that groaned every time someone turned on a tap in any apartment, as if the water had to fight to make its way through pipes narrowed by decades of limescale built up on their inner walls. In the elevator that trembled and shook between floors, as if the cables holding it up were negotiating with gravity every time someone pressed a button and the cabin started rising with a metallic moan that made you grab the handrail without thinking. It was a building that made noises. All old buildings make noises, but this building's noises were familiar noises, predictable ones, cataloged by my brain after 2 years of living there as normal sounds that didn't deserve attention or concern. The creak of the structure when the temperature dropped at night and materials contracted. The gurgle of water in the bathroom pipes when the upstairs neighbor flushed the toilet. The click of the central heating thermostat turning on and off with the regularity of a clock. The hum of the electrical panel on the landing, vibrating at a low frequency you could feel in the soles of your feet if you stood in front of it long enough. Sounds with a cause and explanation that were part of the building's vocabulary, like words are part of a language you learn to speak without thinking about the grammar. The thumping that night didn't belong to that vocabulary. It was a new sound, a sound the building hadn't made in the 2 years I'd been living there. A sound that didn't correspond to any of the usual noises I'd learned to ignore. But on a Monday at 2 in the morning, half asleep and with my head still foggy, I didn't give it any more importance than you'd give a neighbor making noise at an odd hour. The next day I forgot to mention it to the janitor, and Tuesday night I slept without interruption and thought it had been an isolated incident. One of those things that happen once and don't repeat, and over time become a blurry memory you're no longer sure was real or something you dreamed. Wednesday they came back. Same approximate time, between 2 and 3 in the morning. But this time it wasn't just thumping. There was something else, a dragging sound, heavy and continuous, like something bulky sliding across a hard surface with the rough friction of what could be stone against stone or rubble against tile. And between the thumping and the dragging, a noise that sounded like a drill but more muffled, more distant, as if the bit were working through several layers of material that dampened and distorted the sound before it reached my ears. The whole thing sounded exactly like construction work, like one of those renovations that turn an apartment into a war zone for weeks and fill the stairwell with white dust and noise and workers going up and down with bags of debris. Someone was doing construction in some apartment in the building at 2 in the morning, drilling, hammering, dragging debris. The 3 basic sounds of any renovation, combined in a pattern anyone would recognize who's ever lived in a building where a neighbor decides to knock down a wall or redo the bathroom or open up the kitchen to the living room, and for weeks turns the lives of the other neighbors into an exercise in patience and earplugs. I got out of bed and walked through the apartment in silence, barefoot on the cold tiles, pressing my ear to walls and the floor, trying to pinpoint the origin of the noise with the precision that the early morning and the silence of the sleeping building allowed. In the bedroom it sounded distant, diffuse, like an echo bouncing off multiple surfaces. In the living room it was a bit clearer, especially on the wall facing the building's interior courtyard. In the kitchen it was louder, and I could distinguish individual thumps more clearly. And in the bathroom, when I pressed my ear to the wall facing the interior courtyard, the noise was clear enough to distinguish each individual blow, each pass of the drill, each drag of what sounded like rubble moving over a tile or concrete surface. The sound was coming from below. Not very far below, not from the basement or the ground floor, but from directly beneath my apartment. From the 3rd floor, from Leandro's apartment. Leandro was the neighbor on the 3rd floor, a man around 60, divorced for over a decade, who lived alone in an apartment that had been the family home before the divorce and was now too big for one person. But Leandro refused to leave because he'd spent his entire adult life within those walls, and because moving would mean accepting his life had changed in a way he still hadn't fully processed. He was a quiet man, with predictable routines and minimal conversation, limited to polite greetings in the elevator, and the occasional comment about the weather or the never-ending construction the city was doing on the next street over. That had been complicating. Parking for months. He worked as an administrative assistant at a downtown office and left the house every morning at 8:15 with a leather briefcase worn by the years that must have been expensive when he bought it, but now had peeled edges and a handle, reinforced with duct tape that Leandro had put on himself, because he didn't like throwing away things that still worked, even if their appearance said otherwise. He wasn't the type of person who would do construction in his apartment at 2 in the morning. He wasn't the type of person who would do construction in his apartment at all, because his apartment was well maintained with a conservative, austere maintenance that consisted of fixing what broke without changing anything that didn't need changing. The next day I ran into him in the entryway at the time we both left for work. crossing paths by the mailboxes as we did every morning with a brief greeting and a nod that was our way of acknowledging each other without committing to conversation. I asked if he was doing renovations in his apartment. Leandro stopped with his hand on the entryway door halfway through opening it and looked at me with an expression that started as confusion and in the space of a second transformed into something different, something that wasn't confusion but recognition, as if my question had confirmed something he'd been suspecting for a while, but hadn't dared to voice aloud because saying it aloud made it real. And as long as it stayed inside his head, it could still be imagination or an effect of insomnia or any other explanation that let him keep sleeping at night without thinking too much. He told me he wasn't doing any renovations, that he hadn't hired anyone, hadn't bought materials, hadn't requested permission from the homeowners association, which was mandatory procedure. He told me he was hearing the noises too. Every night, between 2 and 3 in the morning, the same thumping, the same drill, the same dragging of debris that I was hearing from my 4th floor. But Leandro didn't hear them coming from above or below. He heard them coming from the walls, from inside the walls of his own apartment. He told me one night he'd gotten up and pressed his ear to the living room wall, the one facing the party wall with the building next door, and the thumping sounded like someone on the other side of the partition was hammering against the brick with the intention of breaking through. He told me this in a low voice, almost a whisper, looking around the entryway as if to make sure no one else was listening. With that particular embarrassment, rational people feel when they find themselves saying something that sounds irrational, and yet is exactly what they've experienced. He told me he'd gone down to ask on the 2nd floor, thinking maybe the noises were coming from there and the building's old acoustics were fooling him. The neighbor on the 2nd told him she wasn't doing renovations either, and that she also heard noises but thought they were coming from the 3rd floor, from Leandro's apartment. I told him I heard them as if they were coming from his apartment from the 3rd. Leandro nodded slowly, a nod that had more defeat in it than confirmation, and told me that was what didn't make sense. That each neighbor thought the noises came from another neighbor's apartment, but none of them were doing renovations. That the noises weren't coming from any specific apartment, that they were coming from somewhere between the apartments, inside the building's structure, in that intermediate space between one floor's subfloor and the next floor's ceiling where pipes and cables run, and where there are layers of concrete and brick and beams that form the building skeleton, and that no one sees or touches since the masons placed them 80 years ago. The noises were coming from inside the walls. That night I stayed awake waiting. At 10 after 2 the thumping started. This time I was ready. I got up and went to the bathroom, where the sound came through clearest and most defined, and pressed my ear to the interior courtyard wall with my cheek against the cold paint, and my eyes closed to focus on what I was hearing. The thumps were sharp, defined, with a force that vibrated the wall under my ear with each impact, as if someone were hitting the brick on the other side of the plaster layer with something heavy and blunt. They weren't random blows. They had a pattern. 3 quick thumps, a pause of about 2 seconds, 2 slower and harder thumps, a longer pause of about 5 seconds, and then the sound of the drill for about 10 seconds before the cycle repeated from the beginning. 3, pause, 2, pause, drill. 3, pause, 2, pause, drill. It was too regular a pattern to be random, too rhythmic to be the result of an accidental mechanical process, and too irregular to be a programmed machine. It was the pattern of something working with method, with a system, with a purpose that followed an internal logic I couldn't decipher, but that existed with the clarity of a score written for instruments that shouldn't be sounding inside the walls of a residential building at 2 in the morning. I put my open palm on the wall. The surface was cold, as interior walls of old buildings always are in November. But beneath the cold, beneath the layer of paint and plaster and brick, I felt something. A vibration. Not the vibration of the thumping, which was intermittent and stopped between impacts with those pauses that marked the rhythm of the pattern. A different vibration. Constant, continuous, without pauses, like the tremor of something moving steadily inside the structure with a slow, heavy motion that made the whole wall vibrate at such a low frequency, you couldn't hear it with your ears, but felt it in the palms of your hands and in your chest when you pressed against the surface and stayed still long enough for your body to tune into that frequency and recognize it as something that shouldn't be there. I told the janitor what was happening. His name was Braulio, and he'd been in the building for almost 30 years and had keys to every door, every meter room, every utility closet, and every access point to the corners of the building that normal neighbors never see, and only the janitor knows because they're the spaces where the machinery that keeps the building running lives. Braulio was a short, stocky man with close-cropped graying hair and large hands with calluses on the palms that betrayed a lifetime of manual labor. Hands that were always busy with something. A broom, a screwdriver, a rag, the keys to the meter room hanging from his belt on a carabiner that jingled when he walked through the entryway. I described the noises to him. The pattern of thumping, the constant vibration in the wall, the conversation with Leandro and the second-floor neighbor, the fact that each neighbor thought the noises came from a different apartment, but nobody was doing renovations. Braulio listened without interrupting, standing in the entryway with his arms crossed over his chest and his gaze fixed on some spot on the terrazzo floor that seemed to interest him more than my words, with the attitude of someone listening to something they've heard before and know how it ends. When I finished, he stayed quiet for a while, long enough for the silence of the entryway to fill with the ticking of the wall clock above the mailboxes and the distant hum of the elevator going up to some floor with its usual groan of cables and pulleys. Then he told me something I didn't expect. He told me the noises weren't new, that the building had been making those noises intermittently for years, appearing for a few weeks or months, and then disappearing without explanation for longer periods that could last several years. He told me the first time he heard them was in the early 2000s, not long after he started working as janitor. Back then, the noises were weaker, more spaced out, harder to pinpoint, and could only be heard in the basement and on the ground floor. The neighbors complained to the property manager, and the manager hired a structural specialist who inspected the building from top to bottom looking for the cause. The specialist checked the pipes, the drain pipes, the central heating system, the ventilation ducts, the main beams, and the load-bearing walls. He found nothing abnormal. Everything was in place, in good condition, functioning as it should. The pipes had no leaks or air pockets that could produce rhythmic thumping. The beams weren't damaged or loose enough to cause vibrations. The specialist wrote a report stating that the building's structure was in good condition and that the noises were probably due to thermal expansion of materials during nighttime temperature changes, a known and documented phenomenon in old buildings. A clean, reasonable technical diagnosis that everyone accepted because it was easier to accept a boring explanation than to face the possibility that the building you lived in made noises no one could truly explain. But Braulio told me there was something the specialist's report didn't mention, something the specialist told him in person, off the official record, while gathering his tools in the basement after finishing the inspection, and before getting in his van and leaving for good. He told him he'd found something strange on the back wall of the basement, in the area facing the party wall with the adjacent building, an area where the building's original brick, a solid brick from the 40s that should have been smooth and uniform, had marks that didn't correspond to any normal construction process. They weren't cracks or fissures or moisture stains. They were pressure marks, bulges on the brick surface pushing outward toward the basement, as if something had pushed the brick from inside the wall, from the interior of the wall, from the space between one building's bricks and the next building's where there should be nothing but mortar and darkness. The specialist told him they were probably manufacturing defects in the brick that had become more visible over time with the basement's humidity. But he said it with the haste of someone wanting to close the subject and leave, and he didn't look at the wall again while gathering his tools, as if he didn't want to give his brain the chance to keep analyzing what he'd seen. Braulio told me that since that first time, the noises had returned several times over the years, and each time they returned he'd noticed something that at first seemed like a coincidence, but over time became a pattern he could no longer ignore. The noises were heard one floor higher than the previous time. The first time in the basement and ground floor. The second time, about 5 years later, on the first and second floors. The third time, about 3 years ago, on the second and third. And now, this time, on the third and fourth, my floor. Each noise cycle occurred one floor higher than the previous cycle, as if whatever was causing them was moving up inside the building's structure, ascending through the walls and floor slabs floor by floor, year after year, with a slowness that wasn't the slowness of something moving slowly, but the slowness of something very large that needed a lot of time and effort to move through a space not designed for anything to move within it. A space of brick and concrete and mortar that should be solid and unchanging, but that something was traversing centimeter by centimeter, with a patience that didn't belong to anything the living could understand. I asked him what he thought it was. Braulio looked me in the eyes for the first time in the whole conversation, and I saw something in his face I'd never seen in the 2 years I'd been dealing with him. It wasn't exactly fear. It was the expression of someone who's coexisted with something for so long that fear has transformed into something else, into a kind of cautious respect, like what you feel toward a natural phenomenon you can't control or stop or explain. He told me he didn't know what it was, that in 30 years he hadn't been able to see it or touch it or find any physical evidence of its existence beyond the noises and the marks on the basement brick, that over the years had spread up the wall like the roots of a tree growing in reverse, toward the sky instead of toward the earth. He told me the only thing he knew for certain was that it was rising, that every time the noises returned, they were 1 floor higher than the previous time, and that the building had 6 floors, and whatever was moving inside the walls had been rising for more than 20 years, and at some point it was going to reach the top floor. And nobody knew what would happen then, whether it would stop because there was no more structure to climb, or whether it would come out. The noises continued for 3 more weeks after that conversation. Every night between 2 and 3 in the morning, with the same pattern of thumping and drilling and dragging that vibrated in the walls of my bathroom and kitchen, and that I sometimes felt in the bedroom floor when I stood by the bed trying to pinpoint the exact spot where the vibration was strongest. And then, one Tuesday, they stopped, without apparent reason, without transition, without the thumps fading like a storm moving away. They simply stopped sounding from one moment to the next, as if whatever was producing them had finished its work for now, and had stopped to rest or to wait for the time to start again. The building returned to its usual noises, the creaks of the structure and the gurgle of pipes and the hum of the electrical panel. Familiar and explainable sounds that for the first time in weeks seemed like a luxury I hadn't known to appreciate. A month has passed since the noises ceased. The building is quiet at night, and the neighbors have stopped talking about the subject with the speed with which people stop talking about things that frighten them, once the apparent cause of the fear disappears, and daily life fills the space the fear occupied. But I haven't stopped thinking about what Braulio told me, that each time the noises are 1 floor higher, that this time they were on the 3rd and 4th, that next time they'll be on the 5th and 6th. The 6th is the top floor of the building, and above the 6th there's no more structure, only the roof, the old broken tiles the rain seeps through in winter, and the sky. And 3 days ago I noticed something I haven't told anyone yet. I was in the bathroom brushing my teeth before bed, and I put my hand on the wall out of habit. That gesture that stayed with me from the weeks of noise, pressing my open palm to the surface to feel if there was vibration beneath the paint. There wasn't. The wall was still, cold, solid, as a wall should be at 11 at night in a silent building. But when I pulled my hand away and looked at the surface in the bathroom light, I saw something that made me bring my face close to the wall until my nose almost touched the paint. A mark. Small, barely visible, about the size of a €2 coin. A bulge on the wall surface, as if something had pushed the plaster from inside with the tip of something hard and sharp. Not enough to break the surface, but enough to deform it. Enough to leave the imprint of a pressure coming from inside the wall, from the space between my wall and the neighbors, from the place where there should be nothing but brick and concrete and old mortar and silence. Every morning there's a new mark. Every morning a little higher than the last. What's rising inside the walls of the building no longer makes noise. It's learned to move in silence, but it's still rising. The street I lived on was one of those residential streets that look like they're straight out of a real estate catalog. Single-family homes with front yards and garages, clean sidewalks with trees planted at regular intervals that provided shade in summer and covered the ground with leaves in autumn that neighbors swept up on Sunday mornings with that ritualistic dedication people have when they care for their neighborhood, because caring for the neighborhood is a way of caring for themselves and maintaining the illusion that the world is an orderly place where everything is in its proper spot. They were houses built in the 90s, all with the same basic two-story design, pitched roofs and exposed brick facades that owners had personalized over time according to their tastes and budgets. A wooden fence here, a pergola in the garden there, a porch enclosed with glass for winter afternoons, a pool that only got used 2 months a year, and the rest of the time was a rectangle of greenish water covered with a tarp, a garden shed where things accumulated that wouldn't fit in the house, but no one could bring themselves to throw away, the kind of street where neighbors know each other by name, where kids play on the sidewalks until dark, and parents call them in for dinner from the door, and where the most serious problems are a dispute over a hedge that's grown too much and invaded the neighbor's property, or a dog that barks in the early morning and wakes up half the block, a street where nothing happens because nothing has any reason to happen. I'd been living there for 7 years. My house was on the left side of the street, a 2-story house with an exposed brick facade and a front yard. I kept reasonably maintained on weekends when I had the time and energy, and that during the week survived on its own with the passive resistance of grass that had already learned to grow without much attention from me. I had a garage big enough for the car and half a storage room, a living room with a large window facing the street from which I could see everything happening on the sidewalk and in the houses across without getting up from the couch, and an upstairs bedroom with a smaller window facing the backyard that at night framed a rectangle of darkness dotted with lights from the houses at the back of the development. From my living room window, I could see the house across the street with the clarity that 10 meters of street and 2 front yards separated by a sidewalk and a roadway provided, lit at night by a street lamp that projected a circle of orange light right between the 2 houses, like a spotlight illuminating a stage where the performance hadn't started yet. The house across the street was identical to mine in structure, 2 stories, garage on the right, front yard with a flagstone path from the sidewalk to the front door. But unlike mine, it had been empty for the past 3 years since the previous owners. An older couple who had retired and moved to a coastal town put a for sale sign on the garden fence and closed the door for the last time one March morning without looking back. 3 years empty. 3 years with the blinds half lowered and the garden growing wild until grass covered the flagstones and weeds climbed the fence, turning it into a green, disorderly wall that clashed with the well-kept look of the rest of the street, like a wound no one bothered to heal. Every so often, someone from the real estate agency would come to show the house to potential buyers. Young couples who looked at the rooms with that calculating hope of people measuring space with their eyes, thinking where they'd put the couch and where they'd put the crib for the baby not yet born. But no one bought. The house was too expensive for the neighborhood or too run down from 3 years without maintenance. Or it just had something that didn't convince them, something they couldn't identify, but that made them walk out the door with an expression of doubt I recognized from my window, because I'd seen it dozens of times in dozens of different couples who went in interested and came out making excuses. Until one Friday in September, the family arrived. I didn't see them arrive because I was at work, but when I got back at 6 in the evening, the for sale sign had disappeared from the fence and there was a moving truck parked in front of the house with its rear doors open and 2 workers unloading furniture, carrying it through the front door with the mechanical efficiency of people who do this job every day, and for whom a move is just a series of objects to be moved from point A to point B without thinking about what they mean. I watched the furniture go by from my garden while watering the plants with the hose, pretending I wasn't looking with that poor pretense curious neighbors have when they don't want to seem like curious neighbors. A gray couch, a dark wood dining table, matching chairs, bookshelves, cardboard boxes labeled with black marker, beds, nightstands, a large wardrobe the workers had to turn sideways to get through the door. Normal furniture, from a normal family moving into a normal house on a normal street. There was nothing about that move that caught my attention beyond the curiosity of seeing new neighbors arrive after 3 years of having a house across the street, with its blinds down and its yard turned into a miniature jungle. I saw them for the first time on Saturday morning. I went out to sweep the sidewalk in front of my house, which was what I did every Saturday as part of that neighborhood maintenance routine all of us followed like an unwritten pact, and I saw them in the front yard of their house. There were 4 of them. A man around 40, tall, thin, with short dark hair and a face that was pleasant without being memorable. The kind of face you see once and couldn't accurately describe the next day because it had no features that stuck in memory. No scars or moles or asymmetries or anything distinguishing it from the thousands of similar faces you see every day on the street. A woman around the same age, brown hair pulled back in a ponytail, comfortable weekend clothes, A smile she directed at me when our eyes met across the street, and that returned the wave I gave her with my hand, while holding the broom in the other. And 2 kids, a boy and a girl who might have been between 8 and 10, running around the yard with the uncontrolled energy of children who've just arrived somewhere new, and still see every corner as territory to explore, and every bush as a potential hiding spot. I went over to introduce myself. I crossed the street and stopped by the garden fence, which had already been pruned and cleared of weeds with a speed that surprised me, because the day before it had still been a green wall of overgrown vegetation, and now it was clean and trimmed as if it had been maintained for weeks. The man approached and offered his hand with a smile identical to the woman's, wide, warm, perfectly calibrated to convey friendliness without being excessive or forced. He told me his name was Ernesto, and they were delighted with the house and the neighborhood and hoped to stay a long time. The woman came over and introduced herself as Sonia. The kids kept running around the yard without paying me any attention. We talked for about 5 minutes. They asked me about the neighborhood, about the neighbors, about the schools in the area, where the nearest supermarket was, and the health center and the bus stop. Normal questions from people who've just moved. I answered everything with the friendliness of a neighbor wanting to make a good impression, and glad the house across the street was no longer empty, because an empty house on a residential street is like a missing tooth in a smile. Something you notice and that bothers you even if you can't explain why. For the first few weeks, everything confirmed the impression of normalcy. Ernesto left the house every morning at 8:15 with a leather briefcase and drove off in his car, a gray minivan he parked in the garage every night. Sonia took the kids out at 8:30 and drove them to school in a white compact car and came back at 8:45. The kids came home in the afternoon and played in the yard until Sonia called them in for dinner. Ernesto came home from work between 6 and 7 and parked the minivan in the garage. A predictable, comforting family routine that integrated into the street's landscape as if they'd always been there, and as if the house had never been empty for 3 years with its blinds down and grass growing over the flagstones. I started noticing things at 3 weeks. They weren't big or obvious or alarming things. They were small details that separately meant nothing but together formed a pattern my brain registered before my conscious mind could put a name to it. The first was the schedule. Ernesto didn't leave the house at around 8:15 the way anyone with a morning routine would. He left at exactly 8:15, every morning, without a single second's variation. Not at 8:14 or 8:16, but at exactly 8:15. As if an invisible alarm told him the precise second he should open the door and walk to the garage with that regular measured step that didn't vary in rhythm or stride length. Same with Sonia. Exactly 8:30 to leave with the kids. Exactly 8:45 to come back. And Ernesto in the afternoon. I timed it for 5 straight days, which is something I wouldn't have done if I hadn't started feeling that nameless discomfort that tells you something doesn't fit, even if you don't know what. He came back at 6:47 every day, all 5 days, without a single minute's variation. Not approximately the same time like anyone who works somewhere with fixed hours returns. Exactly the same time, to the minute, as if his workday didn't to depend on traffic or meetings or unexpected events that make a person arrive a few minutes early or late each day, but on an internal mechanism that brought him home at 6:47 with the precision of a train keeping to its schedule because it doesn't have the ability to decide to be late. The second detail was the lights. The house across the street followed an illumination pattern that repeated every night identically. The living room light came on at 7:15, the kitchen light at 7:40. The living room light went off at 9:10, and the upstairs left bedroom light came on. At 9:25, the upstairs right bedroom light came on. The kids' room. At 10:05, both went off and the house went dark, every night, without variation. Not a single night when the kitchen light came on a minute earlier, or the bedroom light went off a minute later, or someone got up to use the bathroom at midnight and turned on a light that broke the pattern. It was like a program, like an automated sequence that ran every night at the same times with the precision of a system that doesn't depend on the decisions of the people living inside, but on something that controls when there's light and when there's darkness with a rigidity that allows no improvisation. The third detail was what wasn't there. In 3 weeks, the family hadn't received a single visitor. No friends, no relatives, no neighbors coming to meet them besides me that first Saturday. No one had knocked on their door. No one had parked in front of their house who wasn't Ernesto or Sonia in their cars. The kids hadn't brought friends from school. No grandparents coming for Sunday. No co-workers stopping by for a drink. And most unsettling, Ernesto and Sonia hadn't taken out the trash a single time since they moved in. The trash bins by the garage stayed empty, clean, lids closed without a single bag inside. As if that house produced no garbage. As if no one cooked or ate or opened packages or threw away containers or generated any of the waste a family of 4 produces every day simply by being alive and consuming what the living consume. I mentioned it to Paloma, the neighbor next door to my house, a woman around 50 who'd lived on the street longer than anyone and knew the history of every house and every family that had passed through them over the decades. I told her the new neighbors seemed strange to me, that their schedules were too exact and they didn't take out trash or receive visitors. Paloma listened while pruning a rose bush in her front yard with shears that made a dry snap with each cut. She told me she'd noticed it too, that she'd tried to talk to Sonia one morning when they ran into each other on the sidewalk, and Sonia had responded with the same phrases she'd said to me that first day. The same words in the same order, with the same intonation, as if she were reciting a memorized script for neighbor interactions, and repeated it every time someone spoke to her without deviating a single syllable from the established text. Paloma told me she'd watched them from her garden several afternoons and had noticed something that deeply unsettled her. She told me the kids didn't play the way kids play. They ran around the yard and chased each other and laughed, but they did it following a pattern that repeated every afternoon identically. The same route through the yard, the same laughs at the same moments, the same gestures in the same order, the same fake falls at the same spot on the grass, as if they weren't playing, but replaying a recording of a game that had already happened once and was repeating on a loop every afternoon at the same time, with the fidelity of a film projected over and over without anyone changing the script. That night I sat in the living room with the lights off and watched the house across the street through the window. The street lamp projected its circle of orange light onto the sidewalk, and the facades of both houses with a clarity that let me see inside the living room across the way through its curtainless window. At 7:15, the living room light came on like every night. I saw Ernesto sitting on the couch staring straight ahead. He wasn't watching TV because the screen was off. A black, dead screen reflecting nothing. He was sitting on the couch with his hands on his knees, back straight, head facing forward with an immobility that wasn't the stillness of someone resting or thinking or waiting for a show to start. It was the stillness of an object placed in a position with no intention of moving until something moves it. The stillness of a figure in a store window fulfilling its function simply by being where it's supposed to be and looking like it's supposed to look. Sonia was in the kitchen, visible through the side window. She was standing at the counter with her hands resting on the marble surface, motionless, staring at the wall in front of her with the same empty fixity as Ernesto in the living room. She wasn't cooking. She wasn't preparing anything. She wasn't moving. There was no food on the counter, no dishes in the sink, no smell of dinner coming through the slightly open window. She was standing in her position like a piece placed on a board, fulfilling its function simply by being in the right square at the right time. At 7:40, the kitchen light came on, even though Sonia had already been inside with the light off for 25 minutes. At 9:10, the living room light went off and Ernesto disappeared from my field of vision. At 9:25, the right bedroom light came on, and I saw the silhouettes of the 2 kids moving behind the curtains with movements too regular, too symmetrical, too synchronized to be the movements of 2 kids getting ready for bed. Because real kids push each other and fight over the bathroom and leave clothes lying around and do everything their parents tell them not to do. And these 2 kids moved with the coordination of 2 figures in a cuckoo clock that come out and go in at the program time. At 10:05, all the lights went off and the house went dark with the abruptness of a master switch, cutting the electricity all at once. I kept watching the dark house for another hour. At 11:10, when I was already thinking about going to bed and stopping this paranoid behavior of spying on my neighbors from a dark living room, I saw something that made me sit up straight on the couch and move closer to the window until my forehead touched the cold November night glass. A light came on in the house across the street. It wasn't one of the usual lights from the pattern I'd been watching for weeks. It wasn't the living room or kitchen or bedrooms. It was a light coming from the basement, a faint bluish light, a shade unlike the warm white light of the house's bulbs or the orange light of the street lamp or any light I'd seen in any house in the neighborhood. It filtered through a small window at ground level that during the day was hidden by the front yard vegetation, and at night was barely visible among the leaves of the shrubs growing against the house's foundation. The light pulsed with a slow, regular rhythm that wasn't the flicker of a faulty bulb or the blink of an electrical device with a bad connection. It was something more organic, more deliberate, like the beat of something operating on its own cycle that had nothing to do with the household electrical grid, but with a different power source I couldn't identify and didn't want to identify. The light stayed on for exactly 47 minutes. I timed it with my phone clock because by then I'd stopped trusting my subjective impressions and needed concrete, measurable data to convince myself what I was seeing was real, and not the paranoia of a bored neighbor looking for mysteries where none existed. 47 minutes of pulsing bluish light in a basement I'd never seen any family member enter or leave during the day. 47 minutes during which the house across the street stopped pretending to be a normal house with a normal family and became something else. Something operating according to rules that had nothing to do with the rules of houses and families and residential neighborhoods where nothing happens. The next night, it repeated. Same time, 11:10. Same bluish light. Same duration of 47 minutes, and the next night the same, and the next. Every night without variation, like everything else in that house where nothing deviated from the pattern, where every gesture and every light and every movement repeated with the fidelity of a mechanism that can't make mistakes because it doesn't have the capacity to improvise. One night, the fourth or fifth since I'd started watching the basement light, I saw something more. At 11:57, just before the basement light went off as it did every night at exactly 47 minutes, the front door of the house opened. The four of them came out. Ernesto, Sonia, and the two kids. They came out in a line, one behind the other, with a synchronized step that wasn't the step of a family leaving the house, but of four figures moving at the same rhythm, as if connected by an invisible thread, coordinating their movements with a precision no real family could achieve because real families stumble, get ahead of each other, wait for each other, get out of sync. These four figures walked down the flagstone path through the yard to the sidewalk with the fluidity of four gears in the same machine. They all stopped on the sidewalk side by side facing the street, and they stood there, motionless, staring at my house. They weren't looking at the street in general or the neighborhood or the sky or any indeterminate point in the night space. They were looking at my house. All four pairs of eyes fixed on my living room window where I sat in the dark watching them, my heart pounding against my ribs, my breath held behind clenched teeth. And even though my living room was dark and I had no lights on, and it was impossible for them to see me through my window glass from the sidewalk across the street 10 meters away, I had the absolute, irrational, and at the same time perfectly logical certainty that they knew I was there, that they could see me the same way I saw them, that they'd known for weeks I watched them from my window every night, and that tonight they decided to return my gaze so I'd know they knew, and so I'd know they didn't care because whatever they were doing in that house and that basement was already too far along for a neighbor's curiosity to stop it. They stood on the sidewalk for exactly 11 minutes. I counted on my phone clock with fingers trembling over the screen. 11 minutes of four motionless figures on the sidewalk of a residential street at midnight, under the orange street lamplight that illuminated their faces with a clarity, letting me see their expressions for the first time since they'd come out of the house. And their expressions were the same wide, warm smiles they'd greeted me with that first Saturday by the garden fence. The exact same smiles frozen on their faces like masks someone had glued to their skin that they could no longer remove even if they wanted to. Four identical smiles staring at my window in the darkness of a November night, while the bluish light from the basement went out behind them, and the house became a dark silhouette against the sky again. At 11 minutes, they all turned around at the same time, with the same synchronized movement, and walked back to the house in a line. The door closed. The house went dark. The street fell silent. Only the street lamp remained on, projecting its circle of orange light onto the empty sidewalk, where four pairs of shoes had stood motionless for 11 minutes without leaving any mark on the asphalt. Because what had stood on that sidewalk didn't weigh enough to leave a mark, or didn't step on the ground the same way people made of flesh and bone and gravity step on it. I haven't sat in the living room with the lights off again, I haven't watched the house across the street through the window after 10 at night. During the day, the family follows their impeccable routine. Ernesto leaves at 8:15. Sonia at 8:30. The kids play in the yard in the afternoons. The same game with the same laughs and the same fake falls at the same spot on the grass. They greet me when we cross paths with the same wide, warm smiles as always. And I return the greeting with a smile that's no longer natural, but a calculated gesture so they won't notice that I know what I know, and that I saw what I saw that night on the sidewalk. But there's something I can't ignore no matter how hard I try. Every morning when I leave for work and walk to my car, I glance at the house across the street out of the corner of my eye, without turning my head, with that peripheral vision you use when you want to see something without looking like you're looking. And every morning, behind the living room window of the house across the street, there's a figure standing, motionless, watching me. I don't know if it's Ernesto or Sonia or one of the kids because the morning light reflects off the glass and turns the figure into a dark, featureless silhouette. But it's there, every morning, standing behind the glass, watching me leave my house with the same patience with which I watched them those nights, with the infinite calm of something that learned to imitate a family and is now learning something new. Something that has to do with me. Something that requires 47 minutes of bluish light in a basement every night to complete. And every morning the silhouette behind the glass is a little closer to the window, as if what's watching me is approaching the boundary between their house and mine, between their world and mine, with the slowness of something that has all the time in the world and knows that residential streets and quiet neighborhoods are the best place to do what it came to do. Because in quiet neighborhoods, people trust their neighbors and don't. To ask questions when the smiles are wide enough and the yards are tidy enough and trash never accumulates in the bins, because what lives inside the house across the street produces no trash. Produces nothing, the living produce. Only bluish light in a basement and smiles that repeat every day with the precision of something that doesn't know how to truly smile, but has learned to imitate the gesture well enough that no one asks what's behind it. The first thing I liked about the house was the backyard. 100 square meters of grass, with a couple of fruit trees the previous owners had planted years ago. They provided just enough shade to put a table and chairs under in the summer, so you could eat outside with the sound of birds and the wind through the leaves as your background music. It was a single-story house in a residential area on the outskirts. One of those developments built in the late 90s, on land that had once been farmland. And it still retained that smell of wet earth that rose from the ground whenever it rained hard. It would seep through the windows and the cracks in the doors, a reminder that beneath the grass, beneath the garden pavers, beneath the foundations of the houses, there was still soil. Old, deep soil. Soil that had been there long before anyone decided to build houses on top of it. And it would still be there, long after the houses fell and the streets cracked and the development ceased to exist. It was the kind of soil you could feel alive under your feet when you walked barefoot through the garden in the morning. It smelled of roots and dampness and something deeper. Something that had no name, but it reminded you that the ground isn't just a surface you walk on. It is a space with depth, a place where things happen that those of us living above cannot see, cannot control, cannot fully understand. The yard was bordered by a 1.5-meter high wooden fence, which separated my property from the neighboring ones. To the left lived a family with small kids. They had an inflatable pool in the summer, and a rusty swing that creaked every time the wind moved it. It was a sharp, metallic sound, and at certain hours of the night, it resembled the crying of something that wasn't a child. It was similar enough to wake you, and make you lie there listening for a few seconds until your brain classified the sound as just the swing and let you go back to sleep. To the right lived a man alone. His name was Noel. He was around 55 years old, thin. His graying hair was always a bit long and unkempt, and he had large, bony hands. They looked like they were made for working with the soil, because they always had traces of mud under his nails and in the creases of his knuckles. Mud that didn't wash off no matter how much he scrubbed. It was embedded in his skin with the permanence of something that is part of the body, not something stuck on from the outside. Noel was a quiet neighbor, friendly, but in a distant, brief sort of way. It was limited to a wave when we saw each other over the fence, and the occasional short comment about the weather or the state of the lawn. It never lasted more than a couple of sentences before each of us went back to our own business. He wasn't unfriendly. He was reserved. It was the reserve of people who have spent a lot of time alone. They have learned to function without the need for conversation or company, and when they interact with others, they do so with the minimum courtesy that coexistence requires. They offer nothing more because they have nothing more to offer, or because what they have isn't something they want to share with anyone. Noel had been living in the house next door since before the development was built. His house wasn't like the others. It wasn't a catalog house from the 90s, with a pitched roof and an exposed brick facade, and a 2-car garage and a landscaped garden. It was an older house, lower. It had whitewashed walls that had turned gray over the years, and a roof of old tiles where moss grew in the spots that didn't get sun. And where the tiles were broken, they left dark gaps that looked like eyes, staring downward. The house was already there when they bought the land for the development, and Noel refused to sell his property, so the development was built around it. His plot was left there, integrated into the row of new houses like an old dark tooth in a row of white porcelain dentures. His garden was also different from the rest of the neighborhood. It wasn't a garden designed for leisure with trimmed grass and a barbecue and outdoor furniture. It was a garden of soil, just soil, no grass, no ornamental plants, nothing but dark, brown earth. And Noel kept it loose and turned over as if it were a vegetable patch, but nothing ever grew there because he never planted anything. He just turned the soil. He dug it, flipped it, smoothed it, and then started again a few days later. It was as if the act of digging was an end in itself, not a means to make something grow, not in that garden where the soil seemed to reject anything that tried to take root in it. The first few weeks after I moved in, I didn't pay attention to Noel's gardening habits. Everyone has their quirks, and a neighbor's quirks are something you learn to accept as part of the landscape. When you live in a development where properties are separated by fences that aren't high enough to prevent you from seeing what the neighbor does, but aren't low enough that you have to make an effort to look. Noel dug in his garden in the afternoons when the weather was good. I mowed my lawn on Saturday mornings. Each of us did our own thing on our own property, without bothering the other, without needing to talk more than we already did, which was almost nothing. And that seemed enough for both of us. But one spring night, the first hot night of the year, I left the bedroom window open. I wanted to let in the cool garden air, with its smell of freshly watered grass and damp earth and flowers beginning to bloom in the neighbors' yards. And I was woken by a sound. It was coming from Noel's property, a rhythmic, metallic sound, the unmistakable sound of a shovel sinking into soil and lifting a shovelful that dropped to the side with a dull, wet thud. It repeated every few seconds with the regularity of a clock. I looked at the bedside clock, 2:40 in the morning. I got up and went to the bedroom window facing the backyard. From there I could see Noel's property, over the wooden fence that separated our gardens. The moon was nearly full. Its light gave the garden a cold, bluish clarity. I could see the shapes clearly, though it stripped them of color, turning them into shades of gray and silver. It made everything look like an old photograph of a place that no longer exists. And Noel was in his garden, digging. He was standing in the middle of the plot, with a shovel in his hands, driving the blade into the earth with a mechanical, repetitive motion. It had the cadence of something that had been doing it for hours without stopping, and had no intention of stopping. Dig, lift, turn, drop, dig, lift, turn, drop. Around him there were several piles of dirt. It meant he'd been digging for a while. The hole at his feet was already considerable. It was deep enough that the soil he removed had to be lifted above his waist before being dropped to the side with that dull thud that had woken me. I watched him for about 10 minutes from the window. I held the curtain aside with one hand, the other resting on the frame. Noel never looked up. He didn't look toward my house or toward any other point, only at the hole at his feet and the dirt he was removing, with that mechanical cadence that didn't vary in rhythm or force. It was as if his body were running on autopilot and his mind were elsewhere, focused not on the physical act of digging, but on what he hoped to find beneath the soil, if he dug deep enough and in the right spot. His face was lit by the moon. It wore an expression not of effort or tiredness, but of absolute concentration. It was the expression of someone searching for something with urgency, the urgency of knowing that time is running out, but unable to dig faster because haste might make them miss it, and they would have to start over, somewhere else. At 4 in the morning, he stopped digging. I saw him set the shovel on the ground and begin refilling the hole with the same dirt he'd removed. He pushed it with his hands and feet and smoothed the surface with the back of the shovel until the hole disappeared. And the garden was once again an expanse of brown soil, with no visible marks showing someone had been digging there for over an hour in the middle of the night. When he finished refilling, he stood looking at the ground for a long few seconds. The shovel hung from his right hand, and his head was tilted downward. It was as if he was listening to something coming from beneath the earth, something only he could hear, telling him that tonight too he hadn't found what he was looking for, and he would have to try again tomorrow, somewhere else in the garden. The next night, it repeated, and the next, and the next. Every night, between 2 and 4 in the morning, Noel went into his garden and dug a hole in a different spot on his property. Each night, the hole was deeper than the last. It was as if each failed attempt convinced him that what he sought was deeper than he'd dug the night before. He needed to go further down, and each night, before dawn, he refilled the hole and smoothed the surface with methodical care so no trace remained, though the turned soil left a different color from the compacted earth around it, and anyone looking over the fence at Noel's garden could see the circular patches of darker, looser soil, marking where he dug, like scars on the skin of a body that has been operated on many times, in different places. After a week of nights watching from my window, I decided to ask him. I found him one afternoon in his garden. He was standing by the fence separating our properties, looking at the ground with his hands in his pockets, and that expression of concentration I'd seen every night by moonlight. I greeted him over the fence and asked him directly what he was looking for. I told him I'd seen him digging at night, and if he needed help with anything, he could count on me. Noel looked at me with an expression it took me a few seconds to interpret, because it wasn't what I expected. It wasn't shame at being discovered, or surprise, or irritation at the intrusion. It was relief. The brief, contained relief of someone who has been doing something alone for a long time, and suddenly they realize someone has seen them, and they no longer have to pretend they're not doing it. He told me he was looking for something he'd buried years ago in the garden. He didn't tell me what it was. He told me he'd buried it in a specific spot he remembered clearly, next to the second tree, counting from the back fence, a meter deep, in a wooden box he'd made himself with pine boards and nails, and he'd sealed it with wax to keep moisture out. But when he went to dig it up, it wasn't there. He dug in the exact spot where he'd buried it and found nothing. Not the box, not what was inside it. No trace of the wood or the nails or the wax. Nothing. It was as if the earth had swallowed it, or as if what was inside the box had broken through the boards and left. He dug deeper, thinking maybe he'd miscalculated the depth, and still nothing. He dug around it, thinking maybe he'd misremembered the position, and still nothing. What he'd buried was not where he'd put it. It had moved. I asked him what he meant by moved. Noel looked me in the eyes with a fixity that made me understand he wasn't speaking figuratively. He wasn't exaggerating. He wasn't using a metaphor to describe a memory failure. He told me what he'd buried, moved beneath the earth. He told me he'd been digging for weeks in different spots in the garden, following a pattern he could perceive but not explain. Something he felt in his hands when he touched the soil. It indicated the direction it had shifted, as if the earth retained a trace of its passage, a trace that could only be detected with fingers sunk in up to the wrists and attention focused on something that wasn't sound or smell or texture. It was something more primitive, something the human body can perceive when in direct contact with the ground, and the mind can't name it because it has no words for what's felt beneath the soil, a meter deep, in a garden where something moves without legs, without muscles, without any mechanism of locomotion that biology can explain. He told me what he'd buried was moving east, toward my property. Each night, when he sank his hands into the earth and closed his eyes and sought that sensation that indicated direction, the signal was stronger toward the east, toward the fence separating our gardens, toward the soil beneath my grass and my fruit trees and my house's foundations. He told me he'd been digging for weeks, trying to find it before it crossed the fence, because if it crossed into my property, he could no longer dig without my permission, and without having to explain what he was looking for. And he didn't want to explain what he was looking for, because what he was looking for wasn't something he wanted to explain, nor something I would want to know. I asked him why not. Noel was silent for a moment. It stretched between us, like the shadow of the fence lengthening over the ground in the evening light. The birds sang in my garden trees, with that carelessness of birds unaware of what lies beneath the soil they perch on. Then he told me what he'd buried wasn't dead. When he buried it, he thought it was. It had all the signs of something that had stopped functioning. It didn't move, it didn't breathe, it didn't react to anything, and he'd waited several days to be sure, before putting it in the box and nailing the lid and sealing it with wax. He went into the garden at night and dug the hole, and left it there beneath the earth, believing it was the end of something. But the earth had changed it. The earth does things with what is buried in it that no one fully understands. And what he had put under the ground years ago, believing it was dead, had turned out not to be. Or it had turned out to be dead in a way that wasn't final. A form of death that the earth could reverse, or transform, into something that was no longer death, but wasn't life either. Something in between, that moved beneath the soil, with the slowness of roots, and the persistence of underground water currents that aren't seen, but are there. Always moving, always seeking a path. He didn't tell me what it was. I asked 3 times, and 3 times he deflected the question with a wave of his hand and a headshake that meant he wasn't going to answer that, and not to insist, because the answer was worse than the question. He told me what mattered wasn't what it was, but where it was, and by his calculations it had already crossed the fence. It was beneath my garden, moving east. With the same steady slowness it had moved beneath his for weeks, advancing a little each day, unhurried, like something that knows the earth is vast and has all the time in the world to get where it wants to go. That night I couldn't sleep. I stayed awake in bed with the window open, listening to the garden sounds, the wind through the fruit tree leaves, the distant creak of the rusty swing, the crickets singing with that mechanical insistence they have when the night is warm and the air is humid. And beneath all of that, beneath the normal sounds of a spring night in a suburban development, where nothing abnormal should happen, something more. A sound I couldn't identify the first time I heard it, but over time, I learned to recognize it. It was the sound Earth makes when something moves within it. Not a loud or obvious noise. A low creak, almost imperceptible, like the sound of tree bark when it grows too fast and cracks from the pressure of what's inside. A creak coming from the ground of my garden, from the subsoil, from somewhere beneath the grass and tree roots, and the layers of earth accumulating meter by meter until reaching the bedrock supporting everything above. The next morning, I went into the garden to check something I hoped not to find, and I found it, exactly where I feared it would be. Disturbed soil. A circular patch about 30 centimeters in diameter, by the fence separating my garden from Noel's. At the point closest to his property, the grass had lifted slightly, as if something had pushed it from below. A gentle but constant pressure that had loosened the roots and shifted the soil holding them. The grass wasn't broken. There was no hole, no crack, nothing to indicate someone had dug there with a shovel or hands. The earth had moved from below, from within, from the place where something advanced centimeter by centimeter eastward with that slowness Noel had described. And now I could see it with my own eyes, in the way the grass bulged slightly over the patch, like skin rising over a broken bone that hasn't yet pierced the surface, but pushes from within, with the insistence of something wanting out. I went to find Noel. He wasn't in his garden. He didn't answer when I knocked on his door. His car was in the driveway. The blinds were up. The back garden gate was open. But Noel wasn't anywhere visible in his house or on his property. What was there, though, was the shovel. It was leaning against the fence separating our gardens, on my side. The blade was stained with fresh, dark earth, as if someone had used it recently and left it there for me to find, for me to continue where he'd left off, for me to dig in my own garden and find what he hadn't been able to find in his, because what he sought was no longer beneath his soil. It was beneath mine, moving each day a little farther east, toward my house's foundations, toward the point where garden soil meets foundation concrete, and where something moving underground would have to decide, go around the house or pass beneath it. I haven't touched the shovel. It's still leaning against the fence where I found it 4 days ago. It's rusting in the rain that's fallen this week, with an insistence that's turned my garden into a mudflat. My footprints sink 2 centimeters into the muck every time I go out to check the patches, and the rain has made the patches of disturbed soil multiply, as if the rain had accelerated whatever moves beneath the ground, as if water filtered down to where it is and fed it, giving it strength to advance faster and with more determination. The patches are no longer just by the fence. They are in the center of the garden. They are by the fruit trees, whose roots must feel the passage of what moves beneath them each night. They are by the flagstone path from my back door to the tool shed. Every morning there is a new one, a little closer to the house than the day before, like tracks of something walking without feet, below the surface, approaching my foundations, with the persistence of a root growing toward water, or toward warmth, or toward something it needs, something that can only be found beneath a house where someone lives, and sleeps, and steps on the floor each night, without knowing what's beneath the tiles and concrete and layers of gravel and sand, separating the feet of the living from what moves in the earth of those who no longer are. And Noel still hasn't appeared. His house remains open. His car is in the driveway. His garden is still that expanse of turned, empty soil where nothing grows. The earth has been dug so many times, it can no longer sustain roots. It cannot hold seeds. It cannot do what earth does when left alone, which is to give life to what's planted in it. But last night, I went into the garden to look at the patches by moonlight. I can no longer sleep without checking how much closer to the house they are than the day before, and I saw something in Noel's garden that made me retreat to my back door, with my heart pounding in my chest and my legs trembling with a tremor that wasn't just from the cold. There was a new patch in Noel's garden, not a patch of raised earth like in my garden. A sunken patch, a depression in the soil, the size and shape of a human body, sinking into soft ground, as if someone had lain down in the earth, and the earth had slowly swallowed them, centimeter by centimeter, closing over them like a mouth closing over something that has waited a long time to eat, and finally has something between its teeth. And this morning, I went into the garden with the first light of day. I walked among the patches of disturbed soil that now reach my house's back wall. They form an irregular path of bulges and cracks in the grass, marking the route of something coming from Noel's garden in a straight line, toward my foundations. And I felt something beneath my feet that made me stop dead. My shoes were sunk in the mud, and my breath was cut in half. A tremor, soft, rhythmic, constant, like a heartbeat coming from below, as if what moves beneath my garden had finally reached my house's foundations, and was there, right beneath where I stood, waiting. I don't know what it's waiting for. I don't know what Noel buried years ago, or what the earth transformed, or what it needs from my house, or from me. I only know the shovel is still leaning against the fence, and each night, the temptation to pick it up and dig grows stronger, as if the earth were asking me to open it, to make it a path to the surface, to let it out. And each night, it's harder to resist. Because what Noel didn't tell me, and what I've learned alone in these weeks of patches and tremors and sleepless nights is this: the earth doesn't just transform what's buried in it. It also transforms those who walk on it. It is transforming me too. And each night the shovel seems a little more logical, and the idea of digging a little more reasonable, and the voice rising from beneath the ground a little clearer. A little more like a voice I know. A little more like Noel's voice, telling me to dig. Telling me that what's down there needs to come out. Telling me that the earth is deep and patient. But everything that goes down must come up, and all it takes is someone to open the way. The envelope appeared under my door on a Tuesday night. It was a white envelope with no return address, no stamp. Nothing written on the outside except my floor number and apartment letter scrawled in the bottom right corner with a blue ballpoint pen in handwriting I didn't recognize. Something hurried about it, as if whoever wrote it was in a rush to slide it under the door and get away before I opened it. Inside was a sheet of paper folded in thirds, printed in a small formal font, the kind of format used for official homeowners association notices. The header said Extraordinary Community Meeting, and below it was a date, Thursday of that same week, and a time that made me read the sheet twice to make sure I hadn't made a mistake. 11 at night. Not 11 in the morning, which would have already been an unusual time for a neighbors' meeting. 11 at night. Below the time was a location, meeting room in the entryway, and below the location a single line that said, mandatory attendance for all owners and tenants, underlined twice with the same blue pen that had written my floor number on the envelope, as if someone had wanted to add personal emphasis to a notice that was otherwise as impersonal and cold as all the community notices I'd received in the 3 years I'd been living in the building. I'd been living there for 3 years, on the 5th floor of a 6-story building downtown. One of those 60s buildings with gray brick facades and narrow iron-railed balconies, facing a street noisy during the day and silent at night with that particular silence of downtown streets that empty out after 10 because the shops close and the office workers have gone home to their residential neighborhoods and all that's left are the building's neighbors shut up in their apartments with the TV on and the blinds down. It was a building with 12 occupied apartments, 2 per floor, and a homeowners association that met once a year in June to approve the accounts and complain about the elevator and the leaks and the ever-increasing association fees and the janitor who was never around when you needed him. The meetings were always at 7 on a Saturday evening, and always lasted longer than necessary because there were 3 or 4 neighbors who, to use any topic to steer the conversation toward their personal grievances, and turn a vote on the cleaning budget into a debate about who left their trash bags on the landing, instead of taking them down to the bins. I'd never received a notice for an extraordinary meeting, and certainly never at 11 at night. I asked my landing neighbor, a woman named Casilda, who lived in 5B and had been in the building for over 15 years, if she'd received the notice too. She said yes with a quick curt nod, without stopping to talk, without looking me in the eye, hurrying into her apartment with a haste I'd never seen in her because Casilda was one of those who, you stop on the landing to chat for 10 minutes about anything, and always had time for a conversation that started with the weather and ended with the building's problems. But that afternoon she didn't stop. She opened her door, went in, and closed it with a sharp thud that echoed on the landing like a sentence cut off mid-word. I didn't have time to ask her if she knew what the meeting was about, or why it was at 11 at night, or why the notice said mandatory attendance when normal community meetings were voluntary and half the neighbors never showed up. Thursday arrived, and at 10:30 at night I started hearing doors. Not the building's usual doors, the ones that open and close throughout the day with the irregular rhythm of daily life. These doors opened with deliberate care, with a soft, muted sound, as if neighbors were leaving their apartments trying to make as little noise as possible and going down the stairs instead of using the elevator, because the elevator makes noise, and the stairs at that hour let you go down silently if you step carefully on the worn marble of the steps. I heard them passing my landing one by one, 2 by 2, with muffled footsteps fading down the stairs toward the entryway, like a nighttime procession of people heading somewhere they didn't want to reach but had to go, because the notice said attendance was mandatory and the double underline in blue pen left no room for doubt. At 5 to 11 I went down. The entryway was lit with the usual light, the ceiling fluorescent giving off a white, cold light that made everything look paler than normal. The walls, the terrazzo floor, the neighbors' faces. The meeting room was at the back of the entryway, behind a frosted glass door that was normally kept locked and only opened for the annual meetings and for visits from the property manager. The door was open, and the light inside was on. I went in. They were all there. All 12 apartments represented. 21 people sitting in plastic chairs arranged in rows facing a table where the community president usually sat with the manager and the secretary. But the table was empty. There was no president or manager or secretary or agenda printed on sheets handed out at the start of every meeting. Just an empty table and 21 people sitting in silence staring straight ahead with a stillness that wasn't, and the stillness of a group of neighbors waiting for a meeting to start, but of people who already knew what was going to happen and were waiting for the last one to arrive before beginning. The last one was me. I sat in the only empty chair left in the last row, by the door. I looked around for a familiar face that would meet my eyes with a normal gesture, a shrug, a knowing smile from someone who also thought a neighbor's meeting at 11 at night was an eccentricity that could only happen in an old downtown building where things had always been done strangely. But no one looked at me. 21 faces oriented toward the empty table at the back of the room, with a uniformity that wasn't natural. Wasn't the relaxed, varied posture of a group of people sitting on uncomfortable chairs, waiting for someone to speak, but the rigid, coordinated posture of people who'd rehearsed this position many times and knew exactly how to sit and where to look and how much silence to maintain. 2 minutes of absolute silence passed. 2 minutes during which the only sounds were the hum of the ceiling fluorescent and my own breathing, which I tried to control so it wouldn't show that I was nervous, so it wouldn't show that my heart was beating faster than normal, and my hands were sweating on my knees with a cold sweat that had nothing to do with the room's temperature. Then someone spoke. It was Fermin, the neighbor from 1A, a man around 70 who'd been the community president for over a decade, and who in normal meetings spoke with the tired, monotonous voice of someone who'd spent too many years repeating the same budget figures and the same complaints about leaks. But that night Fermin's voice wasn't tired or monotonous. It was firm, clear, grave, with an authority I'd never heard from him that didn't match the affable, somewhat awkward man I knew from the June meetings and the greetings in the elevator. Fermin didn't stand up. He spoke from his chair in the front row, without turning toward the others, staring ahead at the empty table as if addressing someone sitting behind it that only he could see. He said the meeting had been called because there was a new neighbor in the building who didn't know the rules. It took me a second to realize the new neighbor was me. I'd been in the building for 3 years. 3 years wasn't enough to stop being new, apparently. Fermin said the rules were passed from neighbor to neighbor when someone moved into the building, and that in my case the process hadn't been completed, because the neighbor who should have explained them to me, the previous tenant of my apartment, had left without doing so, and that was a problem that needed to be resolved before it was too late. He said, before it was too late, with an intonation that made something clench in my stomach like a fist closing around something soft and not letting go. He didn't say too late for what, just too late. Letting those 3 words float in the silence of the meeting room with the weight of something all those present understood except me, and that no one was going to explain, because explanations weren't to part of the rules, and the rules were all that mattered. Fermin began listing the rules. He did it with the cadence of someone reciting something memorized long ago, and repeated so many times the words came out on their own, without needing to think about them, like a prayer, or a song you learned as a child, and can recite in your sleep. The first rule was that no neighbor should go out onto their floor's landing between 12 at night and 5 in the morning. Under no circumstances. Not to take out the trash, not to get something from the storage unit, not to smoke on the stairs, not for any reason anyone might think of during those hours. Your apartment door closed at 12 and didn't open again until 5. The second rule was that if you heard footsteps on the landing between 12 and 5, you must not look through the peephole. You must not approach the door. You must not make any noise indicating you were awake and had heard the footsteps. You had to stay in bed or on the couch or in the room farthest from the door and wait for the footsteps to move away, which they always did. Fermin said in a tone that sounded like he was trying to be reassuring, but wasn't succeeding, because reassurance can't coexist in the same sentence with the word always, when that word refers to something walking on the landings of a building at 3 in the morning. The third rule was that if someone knocked on your door between 12 and 5, you must not open it. You must not answer. You must not ask who it is. You must not do anything a normal human being would normally do when someone knocks on their door. Because what knocked on doors between those hours was not a human being, and what it wanted wasn't to talk to you but for you to open the door. And if you opened the door, something came in. And if something came in, it didn't leave and you left in its place. But you were no longer you, but something that looked like you and lived in your apartment and did the things you did but wasn't. You and the other neighbors learned to recognize over time by the details, by the way it walked, by the way it closed the door, by something in the eyes that wasn't right, that wasn't entirely human, that stared at people with a fixity normal people don't have, because normal people blink and look away and get distracted, and what replaced you never blinked or looked away or got distracted. The fourth rule was that the elevator must not be used after 10 at night. The stairs were fine, but the elevator was not. Fermin didn't explain why. None of the rules came with explanations. They were instructions, not lessons. You had to follow them, not understand them. The fifth rule was that if you found the basement storage room door open when you'd left it closed, you must not go down to close it. You had to wait until the next day and go down with another neighbor and close it together and not talk about what you saw inside the storage room. If you saw something that shouldn't be there, because sometimes it left things inside the storage rooms, and the things it left were not things you wanted to see alone or remember at night when the building fell silent and the landings filled with footsteps that belonged to no one living in any apartment. The sixth rule was that if a new neighbor moved into the building, you had to explain the rules during the first week, not the second or third. The first, because during the first week, the building left the new ones alone. It gave them time. It let them settle in, arrange their furniture, learn the layout of the apartment and the normal sounds of the building. But starting the second week, it started taking an interest in them. And starting the third, if they didn't know the rules, it started testing them. Walking on their landing a little slower. Knocking on their door with a knock that sounded like a neighbor needing something. Leaving the storage room door open to see if they'd go down alone to close it. Fermin stopped speaking. The silence that followed was the heaviest silence I've ever experienced. A silence that had mass and volume and filled the meeting room like an invisible gas pressing against the walls and ceiling, and the faces of the 21 neighbors, who still sat staring straight ahead without moving. No one looked at me. No one said anything. No one added a comment or clarification or word of encouragement or anything that might help me process what I'd just heard. The rules had been stated. The meeting had served its purpose. What I did with that information was my own business. I got up from the chair with my legs trembling and a dryness in my mouth that made it hard to swallow. I left the meeting room and crossed the entryway toward the stairs. I didn't take the elevator because it was 11:40 at night, and the fourth rule said the elevator wasn't used after 10, even though I didn't know why, and even though a part of my brain, the rational part refusing to accept what I'd just heard, told me this was all an elaborate joke by a group of bored neighbors amusing themselves by scaring the building's newest tenant. I went up the stairs to the 5th floor. The landing was empty and silent. Casilda's door was closed and no light showed underneath. My door was as I'd left it, locked. The doormat straight and the peephole glinting under the fluorescent landing light like a glass eye staring outward without blinking. I went into my apartment. I locked the door. I threw the bolt. I sat on the living room couch without turning on the lights and stared at my apartment door from across the room, breathing fast, hands sweating on the couch cushions. It was 11:50, 10 minutes until 12. 10 minutes until the rules hours began. That 5-hour space between midnight and 5 in the morning when doors don't open and footsteps aren't investigated and knocks aren't answered. At 12:15, I heard the footsteps. They came from the stairs. They came up slowly, with a rhythm that wasn't that of a neighbor going to their apartment, or someone in a hurry or someone tired. It was a leisurely, regular rhythm, methodical, the rhythm of something going up, because that's what it does every night at that hour, and it has no reason to hurry, because it knows all the doors are closed, and no one will come out on the landing to see who's walking on the stairs at midnight. The footsteps reached my floor. I heard them pass across the 5th floor landing with a clarity that told me they were on the other side of my door, less than 2 meters from where I sat on the couch, with my eyes fixed on the peephole glowing in the dark hallway, like a small, cold star. The footsteps stopped in front of my door. The silence that followed lasted 3 seconds, 4, 5. Then someone knocked. 3 soft, spaced knocks with knuckles. The kind of knock a neighbor would give if they needed something and didn't want to disturb too much at that hour. The kind of knock that makes you get up from the couch and go to the door and ask who it is and open it because it's a human sound, an everyday sound, a sound your brain associates with normalcy and community living, and someone who needs help or is bringing you a package, or wants to borrow salt, or tell you something that can't wait until morning. I didn't get up. I didn't go to the door. I didn't ask who it was. I stayed on the couch with my hands clenched on the cushions and my breath held, and my eyes fixed on the peephole while the 3 knocks repeated, this time a little louder, a little more insistent, with a patience that didn't wear out, because what was on the other side of the door had all night to wait and all night to knock and all night to test whether the new neighbor who had been living in the building for 3 years without knowing the rules would open the door or stay sitting in the dark of his living room doing what he should have learned to do from the first week. The knocking stopped at 12:32. The footsteps moved away across the landing toward the stairs and started going up to the 6th floor with the same leisurely, methodical rhythm with which they'd arrived. I heard them fade step by step until the sound dissolved into the building's silence, and all that was left was the distant hum of the landing's electrical panel and my own breathing, which took several minutes to return to a rhythm I could consider normal. That was a month ago. Since that night, I follow the rules. I lock the door at 12. I don't go out on the landing until 5. I don't look through the peephole when I hear footsteps. I don't answer when someone knocks. I don't use the elevator after 10. I've learned to sleep with the building's nighttime sounds like someone learns to sleep with the sound of the sea, accepting that the waves are there and will keep being there, and the only thing you can do is get used to their rhythm and not get too close to the shore. But there's something the rules don't cover that keeps me awake some nights more than I should be. The rules tell you what to do when something knocks on your door. They don't tell you what to do when you stop hearing it, when the footsteps stop passing your landing for several nights in a row, when the building falls silent between 12 and 5, as if what walked the landings had gone away or gotten tired or found what it was looking for, because it's been 4 nights since I've heard footsteps. 4 nights of complete silence between midnight and 5 in the morning. And this morning when I went out on the landing to go to work, the door to 5B, Casilda's door, was slightly open, and Casilda's doormat, which was always straight and clean in front of her door like that of someone who cares for the details of their home, with the dedication of someone who's lived in the same place for 15 years, was moved, shifted a few centimeters toward the inside of the apartment, as if someone had pushed it when opening the door from outside, or as if someone had entered. I haven't knocked on Casilda's door. I haven't asked if she's okay. I haven't looked inside the apartment through the crack left by the slightly open door, because the rules don't tell you what to do when a neighbor's door is open, and the rules are all I have to know how to survive in a building where something walks the landings at night looking for a door that will open. And I don't know if Casilda opened her door or if someone opened it for her. And I don't know if what's inside 5B now is Casilda, or something that looks like Casilda but doesn't blink and stares with a fixity normal people don't have. What I do know is that yesterday afternoon when I came up the stairs after work and passed the 5th floor landing, Casilda's door was closed again. And from inside the apartment came the usual sounds of a person living their life. Footsteps, water running, a closet door closing, normal sounds. Sounds of someone at home doing the things people do when they're home. But when I passed in front of her door, all the sounds stopped at the same time. All at once. As if whatever was inside 5B had stopped what it was doing to listen to my footsteps on the landing, with the same attention with which I listened to theirs. And in the second of silence that followed, I heard something that made me walk faster toward my door and put the key in the lock with trembling hands. A sound coming from inside Casilda's apartment. A soft, brief, almost imperceptible sound. The click of a peephole opening. Someone was watching me from inside 5B through the glass eye of Casilda's door. And what was watching me didn't blink.